Thank you. So, friends, colleagues, honoured guests, I'm Professor Deborah Johnston, and I'm Deputy Vice Chancellor here at London South Bank University. And this evening I have the great pleasure of welcoming you to the inaugural lecture of Professor Shaminder Takhar. Now, before I formally introduce the inaugural lecture, I'll say what I say whenever I speak to a large group of people. I do have a stammer. I will get stuck on words, and it will all be fine. So an inaugural lecture, for some of you, it might be your first time to be in an inaugural lecture. And I wanted to talk about those three really important roles that an inaugural lecture has for us in a university. So that first most important role is an inaugural lecture is a new professor's first opportunity to formally demonstrate their contribution to their discipline and to talk about the journey that they've taken. An inaugural lecture is also a special moment for the schools that host the professor, and it's a moment for schools to celebrate. It's a moment for schools to come together, and I can see that that's happened here. And it's a moment for schools to reach out to their wider networks, to their students, to their alums, to those wider connections. So it's that really important point of connection. For the universities that host an inaugural, so it is a time that the wider academic community comes together, and that is so important. And that's also why the receptions after an inaugural are so vibrant. They are so wonderful. But it's a moment when universities reach out to the wider public, because it's a moment when we can show the general public the esteem and the achievement of our professorial faculty. So an inaugural lecture is a significant milestone in every professor's career. And we're here this evening to hear more about the contribution of Professor Takhar's work and the journey that Shaminder has taken to reach this point in her career. So it's appropriate that we meet in person in this way. It gives due weight and significance to such an important milestone. So given we meet in person, that also means I do the standard introduction. Please turn your mobile phones to silent. Do be tweeting, do be taking photos and tweeting if that's what you want to do, but please on silent. Keep in mind that we are recording. And for those that need toilets, they're signposted just outside. There are no plans for a fire alarm test. So if the alarm does go off, please make your way in an orderly fashion following one of these fire alarm exits. I think I've got that covered then. Okay, so Shaminder will be well known to many of you here. And I know that tonight she is joined by a number of special guests. I'm going to particularly mention her partner, Adrian. So welcome, Adrian. Welcome to you all. So to give an appropriate introduction, I wanted to run through some of those key academic milestones that Professor Takhar's career has taken, at the risk of causing her some embarrassment. Shaminder is a professor of sociology. She graduated in 1988 from Goldsmiths College, University of London. Then she went on to complete a master's in sociology and politics from Birkbeck, University of London, and she followed that by a year in Prague and France, teaching English and learning French. On her return, she took up a number of part-time roles, part-time research assistant roles at Middlesex University, at Goldsmiths College, and at the Association of Metropolitan Authorities. She also worked part-time as a lecturer at the Open University and at LSBU. And somewhere in that time, this is what she says, she was awarded a scholarship to study at the Open University and graduated in 2003 with a PhD. And it was in 2003 that she joined us here as a senior lecturer. So she's had many roles since 2003. You'll be pleased, there are too many to mention here, so a very long list. So I did want to pull out some of those key roles, and you'll hear this again and again, these roles of service, these acts of civic contribution that Shaminder has carried out. So in the last 2 years, she was the interim director of research in her school, and she is currently the co-director of the Social Justice and Global Responsibilities Research Centre with Professor Nikki Martin. And Shaminder is the chair of the school ethics panel. So Shaminder's PhD was the starting point of her research into women and politics, because it looked at political activism and political agency in grassroots organisations. So before and during her PhD, she was on the management committee of the Greenwich Asian Women's Project and Rights of Women. Her interest in research has been at the intersection of race, gender, and has progressed to looking at sexuality and human rights. So if I turn to publications, Professor Takhar has published articles, chapters in books, and she's edited 2 special issues for the Sociology journal. She's published 2 books, Gender, Ethnicity and Political Agency in 2013, and Gender and Race Matter in 2016, with a second volume in the pipeline and another book on EDI, on doing EDI at the intersection of gender and race. And this, you'll see this picture of contribution emerging strongly, because Shaminder is a member of the British Sociological Association, the European Sociological Association, and the American Sociological Association. She's presented many papers at national and international conferences and symposia on race, gender and sexuality, education and social justice. She's on the editorial board for Sociology Journal and Sociological Research Online. She's on the advisory board for Emerald Publishing as a race and gender expert, and she's refereed many articles, chapters and book proposals for a range of journals and publishers, such as Bristol University and Routledge, India. She's acted as a reviewer for the AHRC, for the Leverhulme Trust and UKRI's Future Leaders Fellowship Scheme, and the Laureate Award for the Irish Research Council in 2023. And she was elected onto the Peer Review College for the AHRC in 2022. She was nominated for the Feminist and Women's Studies Association Book Prize for her monograph in 2014. And she received a British Academy grant in 2010 to carry out research with South Asian local politicians. After its publication, she was invited by the Fawcett Society to sit as a commissioner on the Local Government Commission, that was in 2016, to look at the barriers faced by women in local politics. Working with her colleagues, Nikki Martin and Preeti Prem Kumar, she is part of a team that received a grant from the Cabinet Office in this year, looking into loneliness and disability. And her latest grant success is as a partner organisation in a large bid by Professor Rosie Campbell and Professor Sarah Child, entitled The Quality of Women's Political Representation, and this is an ERC project for £5.3 million, looking at the quality of women's representation in Sweden, Belgium, Portugal, the UK and Poland. Shaminder has also sat as a commissioner on the Lambeth Equality Commission in 2016. So, Professor Takhar is the recipient of many grants related to education and has been nominated for Outstanding Supervisor and for Innovation in Teaching. She's seen a generation of students at LSBU graduate and has supervised 8 doctoral students to successful completion, with another in the pipeline. And she stayed in contact with many of her students, some of whom are here tonight. Shaminder's recently contributed to the Acknowledge project funded by the British Sociological Association on materials for teaching race and decolonising the curriculum. And it's in this area that Shaminder has generated a large footprint in the university as a whole, in her work around EDI and the curriculum. So she was Equinet's chair for 10 years, and she's seen through the REC application, Athena Swan Bronze, and created a buzz around Black History Month. She was nominated and highly commended for her EDI work and received the Diversity in Curriculum Award in 2022 for her work on decolonising the curriculum and setting up LSBU's Decolonising the Curriculum website that was launched in January 2022. So, Shaminder has been asked what she would have done if she had not entered academia. And she says, I would have studied fine art or photography or filmmaking, but that wouldn't have gone down well with my parents. Shaminder loves art, and she particularly likes painting abstract art and is in the process of having her black and white photos from the 1980s published. At one point, she thought of going into politics. So I think this was before the general election in 1997. She was at a Fabian Society dinner, and she was approached by the Labour Party to just consider, had she ever thought of standing as a candidate? She did think about it, but declined. And knowing what she knows now, she has huge admiration for women in politics. She told her mother about this years later. She was afraid that her mother would be disappointed about what her decision was. And actually, she was. Though retrospectively, Shaminder's not sure if she would have liked to have been one of Blair's babes. She says that the nearest to the residence of power she's got is a photo standing outside the front of number 10 Downing Street. She says the inside is really like a TARDIS. And she can say that definitively because you may not know that Shaminder is a fan of Doctor Who and Star Trek, as all the best people are, actually. So, with an impressive record of extensive contribution to her discipline, to the university and to wider society, I look forward to her lecture this evening. So special guests, colleagues, please welcome Professor Shaminder Takhar with her inaugural lecture entitled Women, Politics and Gender.
Thank you, Deborah, for those kind words. I really appreciate it. Welcome, everybody. So nice to see so many of you here, and you can hear me. That's quite good. So, that's a bit loud. It's lovely to see so many of you. I'm honoured to be standing here, and I would like to say thank you to my family, friends, and wonderful colleagues in the Division of Social Sciences and the School of Law and Social Sciences, and across the university. I've made loads of friends in my time here. Many thanks also to Professor Jeffrey Weeks. I might have to move this down a bit. Janet Holland and Professor Ros Edwards, who have been supportive in my early career. They retired a short while back. I'd like to acknowledge my parents for the support they have given me over the years, and to pay a special tribute to my mother, who sadly passed away in January 2017. She would have loved to have come here tonight. I would also like to thank Adrian, who's always supported me in everything I do, from musical interludes to serious intellectual conversations and making me laugh. He's very good at that. My father is currently in India, and I know he was influenced by the female presence in our home as we were growing up. I have 3 sisters and 1 brother, and I'll go as far as to say that my father is a bit of a feminist. It is the custom in an inaugural lecture to show some photos. I don't really have any embarrassing photos because it looks so good. But I have one from the British Library in 2001. Those are the days when you had to actually go and have your photo taken, stick it onto a card, and then go and study and be very studious in the British Library. So I kept that. I just found it. That's amazing. The second photo is of me with my sisters, and I hope they don't mind me showing this to them. I'm doing a Charlie's Angel pose, because we all love Charlie's Angels. And my intention here tonight is to take you on a journey through my work and that of a range of scholars, and hopefully provide some insights into the world of politics for women in the UK and globally. Running through my work is how we generate a fair and inclusive society for women, facilitate social change and promote gender equality and social justice. We also need to understand oppression and how powerful discourses and ideology operate. Women also have to deal with patriarchal structures and hierarchies of power, and what we want is to look at women's agency in different settings in electoral politics and grassroots political activism that can influence social policy. I've got a slide here with all these parts to my lecture today, so hopefully you won't go to sleep too much, but it is in 6 parts. So we're going to have an introduction. I'll set the scene, the global context, types of representation of women, marginalised and minoritized women in politics, and are women empowered, and social movements. And hopefully I'll take you on this journey with me tonight. Now, I wrote the abstract for my lecture, which you've probably seen on Eventbrite, a while back, and much has happened since then in the world of politics. If you weren't interested in politics before, you couldn't miss the events unfolding last year with Liz Truss when she was elected as Prime Minister, and the subsequent decline in trust in political parties and politicians. So I would like to begin by looking at some of the concepts in the title of my talk. The first one is politics. In the sense of formal electoral politics, we can include, for example, political parties, representation, government, political systems and elections, campaigning, leadership contests, and even ideology. In the informal sense, we include, for example, social movements, resistance, political mobilization, activism, policy, and suffrage. When someone says, "I'm not interested in politics," it may be because they believe it is too complicated, or out of a sense of fatalism due to powerlessness, which results in non-engagement and a retreat to the private world. After all, turnout at the last general election in 2019 was 67.3% across the UK, which is a decrease of 1.5% from 2017. Unfortunately, this disengagement seems to be a growing global phenomenon linked to the promotion of individual consumption by 40 years of neoliberalism. The second concept is gender. The concept we've seen over the last 2 decades or so that there are questions around gender. In Western societies, people are identifying as non-binary or agender and using pronouns such as they and them instead of he, she, and him and her. The concept gender, viewed from a sociological point of view, is related to the dichotomies, as you can see on the slide: sex, gender, femininity, masculinity, men, women. Femininity and masculinity are viewed as being socially constructed norms with reference to our behaviour and appearance. The meanings associated with gender are dynamic and subject to change, but traditionally, depending on our sex, it is expected that we perform an appropriate gender. So more on performance a bit later. But gender can be viewed on a continuum because we don't neatly fit into one or the other. Academia has engaged with the concept gender since the 1970s against the backdrop of the women's movements to the separation of sex and gender. However, Simone de Beauvoir, writing in 1949, stated in her book, The Second Sex, "One is not born a woman, but rather becomes a woman." If we use a non-essentialist, non-binary view of gender, it provides us with opportunities to think about what gender means as something that is dynamic. Judith Butler's work in 1990 on gender shows us that when we use gender as a verb rather than a noun, gender becomes something that we do or perform. It's important to bear this in mind when we learn about the ways in which women are perceived when they do politics. I have used Judith Butler's performativity in a forthcoming article, The Gender Agenda, in which I discuss the controversy surrounding trans-exclusionary radical feminist thought regarding who can be a woman, and how some feminist thinkers have commented that there are many ways of being female and male, with trans people widening the spectrum of gender expression. There is a related term, intersectionality, and everybody's come across this one, which many of us use readily. Coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, it is a critique of the ways in which concepts such as gender and race are treated as separate categories. Intersectionality argues that gender should be understood relative to other concepts, such as race, class, age, sexuality, and disability. Angela Davis, an icon, writing in 1981, understood the meaning of intersectionality. In other words, what it means to struggle for equality, in which she examines how black women were not considered enough to be included in the woman category. Third concept is equality and equity, and I'm sure people have seen some versions of this poster. I've used the word equality, however, I recognise that language changes over time and that there is a growing attention to the term equity. But we still use equality in EDI and the Equality Act 2010, despite it being seen as inadequate. It is problematic because we use words to represent complex realities of living in the same way as gender is used. US President Biden at his inauguration and Vice President Kamala Harris have both used the term equity, with reference to race, to bring forth a kind of healing process which would restore unity in the US. Critics were quick to state that it looked more like retribution. We've all seen this image, as I said, that represents the difference between equality and equity, which is used to facilitate debate around those two terms. So, my question is, what are we looking for? Are we looking for equitable outcomes in a society or a world which does not view people as equal, never mind in equitable terms? Can we do this, or do we need massive restructuring of power relations with reference to capital, labour and government? And how can we do this without collective action against racism, sexism, homophobia and transphobia? This requires political agency. The exclusion of women from agency has been a key concern of the feminist movement and has featured strongly in social theory. The relationship between agency and structure is a hotly debated issue. Agency has been defined in many ways, but the focus is on action or the ability to act in the face of constraining structural forces, or on how we locate the ways in which social structure also enables agency. It is not a recent phenomenon and has been grappled with, and it's grabbed the attention of philosophers and disciplines have grappled with it for a long time, placing different emphases on agency or structure. For my purpose, I have employed it not only in connection with formal politics, but grassroots political activism on a collective basis. Through a feminist understanding, I show how black feminism has evolved through claiming collective forms of identity and agency while taking into account the historical with a broadening of the parameters of political activism. This is where resistance manifested in social movements is important, because activists seek change through collective action. For example, anti-nuclear, anti-war, anti-capitalist movements, climate change activism, the concerns of unions and the freedom to strike. In a special issue for the journal Sociology, I'll move this on now to show the special issue, we set a challenge to sociology's community, namely to continue to develop high-quality research on areas in which collective action and protest emerge, and in doing so, to continue to explore new methods for research and people's varying engagements with social movements globally. In my edited book, Gender and Race Matter, we argue that although discrimination and prejudice experienced by women vary from one country to another, it is the persistence of inequality that is the main concern. The UN, a contradictory organisation that also embraces the IMF and World Bank, that have promoted the neoliberalism that many argue has disempowered those at the bottom of global society, the 99%, has been at the forefront of campaigns and declarations which promote gender equality. And they promote it as a human right. In 2010, the organisation UN Women was created by the UN General Assembly to monitor gender equality and empowerment of women. Over the last 20 years, many reports have been published that highlight inequalities and injustice faced by women, and the Global Gender Gap Report since 2006 has measured inequalities by charting each country's performance in 4 major areas: health, education, economy and politics. Although progress has been made, the struggle for equality and empowerment continues, with a severe lack of rights and opportunities for women. How can women be involved in self-empowerment if underlying global structural imbalances have not been addressed? This is a very important question. The book was important as it provided a global perspective, from an analysis of, for example, the women's movement in Iran, an analysis of the gang rape in India, the gender security in Burundi, Liberia and South Africa, to indigenous women's sterilisation in Peru. So it covered a lot of ground, and that's just some of the work that covered. Indeed, the scholarship of women, gender and politics needs to be done through a global lens and to increase the representation of scholars from the global south in academic journals. This is a really important point. This is necessary in order to disrupt the hegemony of Western and male writers and to decolonize knowledge. Diasporic scholars in the West and those in the global South during the 1980s and 1990s, such as Chandra Mohanty, Avtar Brar, Kimberly Crenshaw and Amina Mama, I've got to move it on, there they are, to name a few, pointed out that Western feminism did not take into account historical and contemporary economics, structures and processes such as colonialism, neoliberalism and globalization that contribute to gender inequality and discrimination, particularly in the area of political participation and gender security. These are just some of the writers. Chandra Mohanty is actually an academic in the West now. She teaches at an American university, but she started off in India. So hopefully, going back to the Gender and Race Matter book, I hope there is something in the pipeline in terms of a volume 2, so watch this space. So part 1, getting on to, that was just the introduction, by the way. So part 1, setting the scene, the global context. Over recent years, globally, we've witnessed a change in politics which has damaged human rights and gender rights in the form of anti-gender claims and movements that in effect oppose gender equality. In another special issue in Nationalism's Futures, and we have Rogues Gallery here. In another special issue, Nationalism's Futures in 2020, we invited authors to consider how we make sense of contemporary forms of nationalist ideologies and policies and the political and everyday consequences of nationalism. Take, for example, these populist leaders who are united through their espousal of nationalism, populism, and authoritarianism. They employ a nationalist rhetoric that presents migrants, ethnic and religious minorities, foreign people, states, and sexual minorities to liberals as a threat to the nation. So we have Bolsonaro in Brazil, who's openly misogynistic and anti-LGBTQI rights. Donald Trump in the United States. He said, "I have great respect for women." No. Boris Johnson in the UK, he claimed to be a feminist. Narendra Modi's party in India with a particular type of Indian nationalism which criminalises all others. Viktor Orban in Hungary, where women lack representation in government and gender inequality is growing. The recent one is Giorgia Meloni, elected in October 2022. She has described her right-wing party, Brothers of Italy, as a mainstream conservative party. And then, of course, we have Marine Le Pen. She wasn't elected as president or whatever, thank goodness for that. But we do see her caricatured here as wearing a hijab on a street poster on the right. So I think it's a custom in France to kind of go and deface them. I've done that myself, actually. when I was in France, in the dark. We should be worried about the far-right political parties and how quickly their ideas are seeping into mainstream politics. Unfortunately, these shifts occurring globally and locally with the rise in nationalism have impacted on not only asylum seekers and immigrants, but women's position in society. Chandra Mohanty in 2003 commented, and I quote, "These shifts to the right, accompanied by global capitalist hegemony, privatization and increased religious, ethnic and racial hatreds, pose very concrete challenges for feminism." She said that 20 years ago. It is 20 years ago, isn't it? Mathematics. So, I've mentioned the United Nations already. In representative democracies, women are not well represented despite the UN Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17, and achieving gender equality and women's empowerment is central to all of them. There they are, probably know what they are. So now that we set up the stage globally, how have women performed on the politics scene? Not very well. That would not go down very well with my students, this particular slide, because you can't actually see anything, but that's the best I can do. And those figures on the right, you can't see them unless you get a magnifying glass out. So I'll go through a few of them with you. So this map shows women in politics in 2023. They're colour-coded according to the percentage of women in Parliament and lower house of Parliament, reflecting elections appointments up to January 2023. They won't mean very much to you, but if I put this up, slightly better, probably not. We've got the top range is 50 to 60% range, which includes Rwanda, Cuba, Nicaragua, Mexico, New Zealand, and the UAE. The next is 40 to 49.9%, and I've just picked some out. Iceland, Costa Rica, number 7 and 8. 35 to 39.9% is France at 35, Chile at number 44. I won't go through all of them. 30 to 34.9, UK at number 48. Canada at 61, and Zimbabwe at 63. The next one, 25 to 29.9%, 67. Number 67 is the United States, 72 Jamaica, 77 Poland, and 86 Philippines. I'll move this on because I'm sure it's going to hurt your eyes if I keep this up. Okay. If women are involved in representative democracy, we can quite clearly see from that map that I've just shown you that democracies across the world have failed to deliver equality for women in politics, despite the prioritising of the equal participation and representation of women in political life by key global and regional organisations such as the UN via the SDGs, numbers 5 and 16 in particular, the EU Gender Equality Strategy, the Interparliamentary Union, the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association. Particularly marginalised and minoritised women continue to be underrepresented in all the world's democracies. There is a real threat to women's equal participation in politics, in executive leadership and legislatures, given the turn to populism and nationalism that were mentioned before. Karen Sellis and Sarah Childs, writing in 2020 in their work Feminist Democratic Representation, they state that women in both new and more established democracies experience a poverty of representation. And you saw that on the map. The consequence of exclusion and marginalisation of women's interests, experiences, voices from the political and electoral agenda means that inadequate attention is paid to social policy formulation for women and by women. It appears then that the gender equality agenda has had limited prioritisation across the globe, which is particularly relevant for women who experience discrimination and disadvantage at the intersection of race and gender. Indeed, we can see this in the table and the not so urgent suffrage of women since the 19th century. I don't want to read everything out, but you see from the top to the bottom, 1893 New Zealand through to 2015 women in Saudi Arabia vote for the first time. Of course, it is encouraging to see female leaders globally, and the map shows countries, the next map I'm going to show you, by the way, that have had a woman leader in green. 59 UN member states have had a female leader. The first was in Sri Lanka from 1960 to 1965. That's a little bit better, I think. Worldwide, the number of countries that have had women heads of government has risen steadily since 1990. The biggest single year increase occurred in 2010 when 5 countries, Australia, Costa Rica, Kyrgyzstan, Slovakia and Trinidad and Tobago, saw their first woman leaders. An important point to remember here is that if we accept that the inclusion of women in decision-making processes is critical for our well-being, we need to look at how representative democracy works. It has a primary function. It has a primary function to represent the substantive interests of the represented, i.e. those who have elected a candidate with the proviso that the government is accountable. We all do that. We want our MP to represent us, but they don't do that very often. Which brings me to the type of representation that we have. We have descriptive and substantive representation, but you could probably see the 2 types below it, symbolic and effective, which have been added, and they've gained attention over the last number of years. So firstly, descriptive representation is defined as being based on the idea that the representative possesses a particular ascribed characteristic. For example, sex, age, or ethnicity, and by virtue of that identity, will represent that group. The question is about women, in terms of women achieving descriptive representation, is simply about counting the number of women in political office and not examining what women representatives are actually saying. The second part is substantive representation, and here is described as going beyond numbers, more than an increase in women's representatives. It's important that representatives, both men and women, speak for women's interests. However, it's important to note that those interests are defined within specific political, cultural and social contexts. These are definitions by the UN report, Equal Participation of Women and Men in Decision-Making Processes, from 2005. The third one I've listed on there is symbolic representation. The distinctions between these are not very neat. So there are different types of representation, but they're not neatly placed into boxes as I've done here on the slide. Symbolic representation has only recently been paid attention to, and through the examples that will follow, I will hopefully show you that when women enter spaces and leadership positions which have been associated with white men, they are measured against the norm as space invaders. I don't know if anybody remembers Space Invaders. And it's coined by Nirmal Purwa in 2004. But it is where the codified power relations are challenged. Existing research on symbolic representation has analysed the media's representation of women and the impact of women politicians as role models through trivialisation, objectification, infantilisation, particularly when young women have been elected and been out of place as space invaders. Using data for a worldwide study, Global Media Monitoring Project, Amanda Haraldson and Lena Wengenrud stated in 2018 that feminist media studies, in the Feminist Media Studies Journal, that showed that sexist media coverage contributes to the underrepresentation of women in politics. It is powerful. It's got a very powerful influence over voters, parties, and the selection process of candidates. What we're looking at is the broader social and cultural impact of representation of women in politics. Which brings me to the effective representation. There's also been a turn to the effective in social sciences and in political studies, and since this type of representation considers how affect and emotions operate in politics for women. Here I'm talking about the ways in which types of women are constructed through acting in a particular way or using gestures in a particular way. And we're all guilty of judging people in terms of their appearance and the gestures that they use, so this is the effective turn. With so many developments, it's hard to keep up. However, what I will be showing in this lecture that the 4 types of representation are entangled, and that we should understand women's political representation as a melange. That's not just the restaurant that we go to. So what we're looking for at representation is acting for. After all, we vote for people, they represent us. So who's acting for us? If politics isn't working with those who are acting for us, the importance of women's involvement in decision-making processes, democratic structures, and progression toward equality is critical for further progress. It's progress and equality in health, in education, economics, and freedom from violence. Because we all know that entrenched inequalities such as violence and exclusion exist, I argue in my work that if we accept the political systems that exist globally, that's very important, if we do accept them as they are, political parties should reflect the interests of different groups in line with substantive representation. That just follows. If we are serious about this, then practical strategies involving women-only shortlists, quotas, and the removal of obstacles for those wishing to enter politics are desirable to achieve gender equality. In the UK, it's evident that women continue to be excluded from public life and powerful political positions, and was registered in the UN's Human Development Report 30 years ago, 1993. The female othered body is therefore regarded as marginalised, invisible, out of place, the space invader. When women have been elected to positions of power, it can be seen as a leap forward, and it makes it easier for women to see a woman in a leadership position. And in my work, Making the Leap, Community Politics and the Underrepresentation of South Asian Women Councillors from 2014, it was based on a British Academy-funded research with local politicians, cross-party, and also women in grassroots organisations. It looked at the barriers which prevent women from making the leap into politics. This is what led me to be invited to as a commissioner, as Deborah said, on the Local Governments Commission in 2016. However, the election of women doesn't mean that they can be relied on to make decisions for women in terms of favourable social policy formulation. This is why it's important to go beyond descriptive representation to substantive representation. In writing this lecture, I had a problem. There were obviously some female politicians who were regarded as giants amongst political leaders, but were they feminists? Here's some for you. You could decide for yourselves. Indira Gandhi, she was Prime Minister for India during the 1960s and 1980s. She's long revered as a feminist icon, but was actually responsible for the use of discourses of femininity and motherhood to promote emergency sterilisation during the 1970s. She also adopted a very distinctly anti-feminist stance by distancing herself from pro-women ideologies. She just said, I'm not a feminist. Golda Meir, Prime Minister for Israel, 1969 to 74, refuted the need for feminism, but interestingly started her career in women's organisations. And closer to home, we have Margaret Thatcher, who was the Prime Minister for 11 years, from 1979 to 1990. She was also the leader of the Conservative Party for 15 years. She was an anti-feminist and thought of us as a reactionary who cared very little for equality regarding reproductive rights, violence against women, and same-sex relationships. So, not exactly part of the sisterhood. And that's because of her policies, which unleashed the unregulated market, and she did very little to change the cultural misogyny of politics. Theresa May, 2016 to 2019, she was a Prime Minister. You all remember her, surely. Although a founder of Women to Win, she had some interest in the equalities agenda. She's been criticised for not taking a decisive stand against regarding gender equality. She has been commended for being against human trafficking. Who isn't? And introducing the 2015 Modern Slavery Act. And Liz Truss, a firm favourite, I'm sure. In her short-lived premiership in 2022, and possibly due to lack of experience and consultation, did not manage the situation, resulting in disastrous fiscal policies. Or perhaps power went to her head. As a former women's and equalities leader, she did not fare well with reference to women's rights issues. She was criticised for her anti-woke views on women's rights, women of colour, and the LGBTQI community. She was also criticised for axing the gender recognition plan. So, not so straightforward. In this country, we've seen a drive to increase the number of female MPs since the passing of the Sex Discrimination Election Candidates Act 2002. This allows political parties to adopt all-women shortlists. The result has been an increase in the number of MPs since then. There are also groups that have been set up to increase the number of MPs, such as the 50-50 group, which has launched the hashtag #AskHerToStand and hashtag #SignUpToStand campaigns. The aim is to increase the numbers of female MPs. However, even when there has been a substantial surge in numbers being elected, they have been referred to in a derisory manner as Blair's babes or Cameron's cuties. Comments are also made on their hair, voice, clothes, with labels attached to them, such as the Iron Lady when referring to Margaret Thatcher and Golda Meir, and Mutti Merkel when referring to Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel. The masculinist nature of politics and the sexism of male politicians were evident in the mid-1980s when the Conservative Party's male MPs still called all women Betty. And some made crude gestures across the House of Commons that demoralised the Labour women elected in 1997. Furthermore, the entrenched attitudes towards achieving female equality were exemplified by David Willett's comments on the negative impact of feminism on male social mobility in the UK. And recently, reports have emerged that show women in the Conservative Party felt that they were at risk at the party conference. This is very similar to the recent revelations about the CBI. Given the male response to women in politics, it is not surprising that there continues to be underrepresentation. However, this issue is of deep concern, particularly with reference to decision-making processes on a range of issues where women legislators are in the minority. It's not surprising that in 2017, or maybe it is, I don't really know. Which way am I going? Yeah. There's an article here by Fleur Butler, chairman of the Conservative Women's Organisation for Yorkshire and Humber. She wrote an article for The Independent entitled, "We Conservative Women Know the Party Has a Problem with Feminism. It's time we reclaimed it." In the article, she states that right-wing feminism can help conservative-minded women re-engage with the world of politics. After all, who wants to be a member of a party that women don't want to stand for? Perhaps we can extend that to a party that black people don't want to stand for, which is evident in the setting of the 2022 group, to encourage more of the black population to enter politics and to support the Conservative Party. This is from an article in The Guardian on the 7th of January this year. It was entitled "Young, Tory and Black," and it's a take on a song, I guess. The question is, to what extent can women be themselves in a sexist environment in any country? The space in which formal politics is conducted remains a masculinized space with a masculine style of politics. This is also evident in local government level. And furthermore, there's no guarantee that a critical mass will mean that women will act for women. This is also seen in other occupations. Which leads me on to the third part. So we're nearly there, nearly halfway through. Previously, I referred to the female body as out of place in politics. Remember the space invader. In this section, I will look at the double discrimination which is experienced by women of colour. And these are women of colour entering politics. After the general election of 2019, 66 or 10% of MPs were from minority ethnic backgrounds. This is a huge leap from the 4 elected in 1987. Diane Abbott, who's been in the media recently, Keith Vaz, Bernie Grant and Paul Boateng. To reflect the population, there would have to be approximately 85 MPs from minority ethnic backgrounds. I think we're actually getting there. I was looking at the stats just before I came in. In the 2019 election, of the 66 minority ethnic MPs, 41 are Labour, 23 are Conservative and 2 are Liberal Democrats. There are 37 MPs who are minority ethnic women. 2 of them are in Rishi Sunak's cabinet, Suella Braverman and Kemi Badenoch. And for minority ethnic women, there are 29 in the Labour Party, 6 in the Conservative Party. There are some confusing figures, sorry about this, and Liberal Democrats at 2. In the London area, the Mayor of London is obviously Sadiq Khan, and 8 out of 25 members of the London Assembly are minority ethnic women. So it's not too bad. So the global comparison. The figures for the US and Germany are cited as record high levels. The United States, the 117th US Congress 2021 to 2023, is the most ethnically diverse in US history, with around 23% of voting members of the House of Representatives and Senate from minority ethnic backgrounds. In Germany, following the 2021 election, at least 83 out of 735 members of the German Federal Parliament had a so-called migration background. This is defined as either not being born as a German citizen or having a parent who was not. In France, of the 550 deputies elected to the National Assembly in metropolitan France in 2022, 32 had at least one parent whose background was from a French overseas dominion or territory or from a non-European country. So we can see that there's diversity. People are entering politics in a range of countries. So record numbers of minority ethnic women have been elected to government. However, the burden of representation and the experience of double discrimination persists. As a group of women, they face many barriers to success in politics, including the fact that when it comes to selection, the image of the ideal candidate is usually a white male, and that persists. So again, we are still space invaders. I'm going to give you 2 examples. Diane Abbott, as you know, has been in the news recently. She's apologised. And Dawn Butler. Dawn Butler MP commented on not being recognised as an MP. And she wasn't recognised by other politicians and was subjected to derogatory remarks about her ability to perform as a politician. She also stated that there is pressure on black women to represent all black people in the country. And that's because there's so few of us. This statement brings together, firstly, issues of descriptive and substantive representation of women in politics. Numbers are low, burden of representation is high. Secondly, their perceived poor performance by male politicians. Sexism and misogyny are further highlighted through the use of terms such as Stepford wives to describe the unusual and probably unexpected numbers of unbelonging women elected to Parliament in 1997. Thus it becomes apparent that in politics, women hold the power, men, well, I wish it was. That in politics, men hold the power, must be thinking that inside, due to presence in significant numbers. The second example is of Diane Abbott, her experience when she was elected to Parliament as the first female black MP in 1987. It is in the words of Tony Banks, the late Tony Banks, describing the reaction to Diane Abbott when she was elected. When they entered the smoking room of the House of Commons, there was a smoking room, you could smoke indoors then. And he said, "It is rather like one of those enrobed London clubs in Pall Mall. I took Diane Abbott in there soon after she was elected, and the response of the habitués was electrifying. They didn't say a word. Both Diane and I knew the question. In other words, what is she doing here? But she wasn't a cleaner." And that's from the Sunday Telegraph on the 28th of January, 1996. In addition to the racism that can be encountered by minority ethnic women such as Dawn Butler and Diane Abbott, sexism within formal politics exists to disempower women, something that affects women at all levels within the political structures. Thus, although there have been a number of formidable female politicians globally, Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, has been judged on the neckline of her dress and described as unglamorous. And she's been described as unglamorous in the tabloid press, as you'd expect. Margaret Thatcher was described as the Iron Lady, as I said before, because she portrayed a feminine look with a masculine style of politics. Harriet Harman was nicknamed Harperson for her outspoken views on feminism. Theresa May was called Maybot after her Dancing Queen dance. And Liz Truss was called the Truss and the Human Hand Grenade. I didn't even want to say it. And Suella Braverman as Leaky Sue. Not all of them are favourites of mine, as you can probably imagine. So the attire and body of the female politician is also referred to. Theresa May attracted media attention for wearing kitten heels. And this is what the headline said about two female leaders discussing serious political issues. Never mind Brexit, who one-legs it? During research I conducted, it's the Daily Mail, what did you expect? During research I conducted with female politicians, one said that politics is a dirty game. It's a dirty game and it's a dangerous game. Indeed, this is true across the globe, where you can be abused on the basis of your race and gender and be asked for sexual favours in return for success in politics. This has become more evident by the most disturbing aspects of politics for women, which is the abuse received through social media on a daily basis. It includes threats of rape, name-calling, stating they're uneducated, they have no place in politics, and bringing up their sex life. Most female politicians do not know what to do except to report it, but because complaints are not dealt seriously by the political parties, most tend not to. I put a little chart on there for you to have a look at, and there was the Channel 4 news bit on the news about Westminster harassment claims. So minority ethnic women MPs are more affected by online abuse than their white counterparts. There was a finding in an analysis of 177 women active on social media before the 27 general election by Amnesty International. 20 Black, Asian and minority ethnic MPs received 41% of the abusive tweets, despite there being almost 8 times as many white MPs, female MPs. Diane Abbott received over 31% of the abusive tweets, and that graph shows how many she received. Got the biggest column there, red, followed by various other MPs. This amounts to 51 abusive tweets per day. Can you imagine receiving 51 abusive, threatening tweets every day? I don't think I could deal with this, so I'm really glad I didn't go into politics. On coping with the abuse, Diane Abbott said, "I never had this scale of abuse when I first came into politics, and racism was an issue then, as now, but it's the anonymity and the ease of Twitter which has put racists into overdrive." She said, "The first thing my staff have to do in the morning is to go online and delete and block all the stuff." So her staff have to do that every single day. So anybody tweeting about it and tweeting against her and threatening her, they have to block it. Now, after Elon Musk closed his Twitter deal and lifted restrictions, there was a surge of racist tweets. This heralds a new wave of online hate, with one account using the Nazi swastika as its profile picture. Women face violence on a global level every day. The most extreme form of violence is fatal. 2 women were killed while in office. Probably remember Joe Fox, and also Benazir Bhutto, who was the Prime Minister of Pakistan. She was killed in 2007, and both women were in political office when they were killed. So where does this leave us with reference to the pipeline to politics for women? And do women want to be involved in electoral politics, seeing how dirty a game it is, how dangerous a game it is, a fatal game? And my interest in politics and political participation of women comes from researching South Asian women's political identity in the beginnings of my writing in 1998. I then moved on to looking at the political organisation of South Asian women in the diaspora. I looked at expanding the boundaries of political activism and then the construction of political agency. In my British Academy funded research with local politicians, there were barriers to electoral politics that were named. However, when researching women in grassroots women's organisations on their political activism, most did not want to be involved in formal politics because it restricted them in their exercise of political agency with reference to the issues they were dealing with. They felt unfree. They didn't want to be part of a political party. And I don't know if you know, but some people have told me who are politicians, that you are expected to dress in a particular kind of way as a female politician. So the women's involvement in different organisations is associated with resistance to racism and misogyny. Some minoritised women were deeply embedded in patriarchal, racial and class discourses and structures. However, in the process of struggling for equality and rights, they asserted political agency. They resisted direct interventions by the state on issues such as immigration, nationality legislation, social welfare policies, and practice. Previously, I've mentioned that in the edited collection Gender and Race Matter, the authors used gender and feminism as analytical frameworks that covers the experiences of women in different global settings. And this is related to education, political activism, corporeal violence, identity, sexuality, poverty. It also used poetry. It used storytelling, which provide a powerful voice for women against exclusion. Most importantly, it shows how women are able to challenge oppression through circumventing rules, roles, obligations, and prejudice through a powerful agency. So we're going on to the next section now, which is part 4. Are women empowered? A feminist analysis sees women's involvement in activities that are empowering. Empowerment is an important concept to use in the context of human rights and women's rights, and involvement in decision-making processes. However, it involves a contested term, power, with theoretical debates revolving around its meaning. What I have proposed in my writing is not the power over somebody or the loss of power when you give it to somebody else, as if you could give the power to somebody else, but in a generative understanding. This is relational and multiple. That is, its existence relies on the moment that it is exercised within social relationships. It provides women with the capacity for agency and self-definition, a kind of self-empowerment. It's not given to them, it comes from within them. A feminist analysis enables to look not only at power, but how agency operates, that is, consciousness of our position in society. Furthermore, the power too, the generative aspect of power and understanding, facilitates organised collective demands to transform society and to resist oppressive practices. The importance of feminism is eloquently expressed by Judith Butler in 2004. This is one of the best definitions I found. Feminism is about the social transformation of gender relations. So if anybody asks you to say that, and if so, who said it? Tell them it's Judith Butler. It's also important for me, as Chandra Mahanti comments, to build connections between feminist scholarship and political organising, because global economic and political forces have become brutal, exacerbating racial and gender inequalities. This type of comprehension brings together an understanding that combines theory and action. So I didn't just want to work in academia, it combines the two. Equality and rights through a feminist understanding challenges the victim status given to women who are oppressed by patriarchal structures. However, the eradication of structural inequalities associated with race and gender is not an easy task. We live with risk, we live with alienation, we live with exclusion and conflict, yet we strive for social justice that presents itself as a desire for conviviality that Paul Gilroy talks about in his work, and a sense of belonging to a community. All of this occurs in the context of globalization, individualism, plurality, and uncertainty, so the answers are not simple or straightforward. Similarly, the issues of a community and belonging come through as complex and contradictory. However, what we hear are the voices of those who could easily be marginalized or easily be excluded from society, and how in an increasingly fractured world, strategies are employed at a micro level to facilitate social change. And this is what was going on in the women's organizations. It acknowledges multiplicity of discrimination, but locates women at the center of a dialogue. It presents key interventions in gender and race matters through the inclusion of marginalized groups by giving them a voice, rather than silencing them. So in the two works that have been put up before, Gender and Race Matter collection, and Gender, Ethnicity and Political Agency, the two books, both of these books, they contribute to the study of women's agency and how their voices can be heard in the face of powerful discourses and ideology. Given women's political activism at grassroots level, it's equally important to acknowledge that strong women's movements across the globe have been pivotal to gains in gender equality. Social movements operate to bring about social change. You become involved in a social movement because you want something to change, not because the state is giving it to you. And social movements were evident in the presidential campaign for Barack Obama. He used grassroots movements and young people especially, and also Twitter and so on, I think that was then, to raise the consciousness of young black people with a favourable outcome. He was elected as president. Over the last 2 decades, the global reach of movements is exemplified by the anti-globalization and Occupy movements, the Arab Spring, the women's marches after President Trump's election. A newer version of movements has emerged, which is a composite of the local and the global, aided by social media. The trending worldwide of campaigns such as Black Lives Matter and Me Too, sorry, I forgot to move this on, Me Too movement, reflects not only the interest in matters of racial injustice and sexual harassment, but shows the scale of racism and misogyny worldwide. It's on a global level. People's involvement in such political matters has challenged what was, in any case, the myth of apathy or depoliticization of societies and individuals by a neoliberal agenda and career politicians. It is therefore important for feminists to be part of social movements as a sites for the construction of knowledge, communities, and identities. One of the most powerful weapons which we can use for gender equality is equal access to education. Although unequal access may be thought of as the preserve of developing countries, it is evident in most. The most extreme form that we witnessed has been in Afghanistan. Yet even under the most oppressive circumstances, we have seen time and time again the bravery of women across the globe. And the bravery of women is to resist and challenge, is to resist those structures that will prevent them from doing something or attending schools and so on, as in the case of women in Afghanistan. Now, it's here where social movements play a role in exercising political agency. In her work, Freedom is a Struggle, Angela Davis states, "I don't think we can rely on governments, regardless of who is in power, to do the work that only mass movements can do. It is in collectivities that we find reservoirs of hope and optimism." In 2006, Tarana Burke, featured on the front of the Time magazine as being a Person of the Year, founded the Me Too movement and began using the phrase Me Too to raise awareness of the pervasiveness of sexual abuse and assault in society. And in 2013, depicted on the slide here, is a photo of 3 radical black organisers, Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors and Opal Tometi. They created a black-centred political will and movement-building project called Black Lives Matter. That's where the hashtag Black Lives Matter comes from. It was in response to the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's murderer, George Zimmerman. If new social movements are operating in a neoliberal capitalist milieu, are we simply talking about reforms that can be made easily by those in power without disturbing the status quo? So just reformism. This is a pessimistic view of the capability of human political agency. However, reformist action by governments is usually assessed on whether or to what extent the demands for social change can be accommodated or seen as beneficial in electoral politics. For example, same-sex marriage or green issues. How many times has that come up? And now we move on to almost the end, part 5, social movements. The work of mass movements has brought inclusion of different groups, such as women through voting rights, African Americans through civil rights, an end to apartheid. And these examples illustrate the conditions under which new social movements emerged and how they have dealt with coercive practices of the state. It is very difficult to act against the state. And in terms of acquisition of global sport and a right to demonstrate, all these were demonstrated through their political actions. Now, we're familiar with movements that are deeply entrenched in our psyche, or is viewed as having changed the world. They include the student protests of 1968, the civil rights movement, anti-apartheid, environmental, feminist, anti-nuclear, animal rights, gay liberation movements. Have the long road to freedom and the decision by communities to transform some of the basic and economic political arrangements in our society, and I have to thank Alex Vitali for this quote, has often been marked not only by police and military brutality, but also surveillance, infiltration, and more recently, tracking of social media activity and associations with terrorism. In Afghanistan, Taliban rule has had a devastating effect on the rights of girls and women. The violation of policies regarding access to education and health, curtailed freedom of movement, expression and association means there's a real risk to their survival. Women were employed prior to the Taliban takeover in a range of occupations, including politics. Even in the face of such restrictions, Amnesty International reported in March this year, women took to the streets in peaceful protests that formed a women protesters group. But violence was used against them, and once arrested, they were subjected to torture. Women have shown in these circumstances that in the face of extreme hostility and violence, some women were prepared to sacrifice themselves to regain their rights. Similarly, in Iran, women have been successful in education, and the number of women who are highly educated has been increasing. Yet they face gender inequality in employment and decision-making roles. Elahi Rostami-Povey in the collection Gender and Race Matter has shown that Iranian women are actively involved in challenging gender oppression. And in the recent protests, as you can see on the slide, against the compulsory wearing of the hijab, women have been arrested and killed. Teenagers have been arrested with a TikTok showing them dancing without headscarves. The state has installed cameras in public spaces to identify women not wearing a headscarf. Another picture shows you Chinese women. In China, the hashtag #MeToo movement has a phonetic translation which in Mandarin means rice bunny. It's opened up a virtual space for collective action and support among women regarding sexual harassment and assault in universities and in the entertainment industry and politics. Women in China face strict obstacles on activism with imposed censorship. They are then forced to change their strategies to circumvent censorship and keep the campaign alive. In embedded power structures, men in the upper echelons of government remain untouchable. The movement has built solidarity with other groups, evidence collection, and legal advice given to women by women. Another example on there is of the Pussy Hat Project, was in response to President Trump's inauguration when women wearing pink hats came out in demonstration globally to protest against Trump's misogynist views. And this one, which you might find one of those images disturbing, two of those images, a beating of a woman in Tahrir Square by the military became the symbol for protesters in Egypt 2011. A video recording showed how she was violently beaten and her clothes ripped off to show her blue bra and her torso. And this was in a public space. Do you remember I was talking to you about living with risk in political places and also protesting? The Egyptian military was forced to apologize because there was shock and international outrage and anger at that image. They apologized, and the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces expressed regret to Egyptian women at their transgressions. Women came out in protest, and you can see that on there at the bottom. And they used the actual image on the placards, and it was the subject of graffiti. In Egypt, women have been at the forefront of revolutionary aims and have displayed significant levels of agency, despite some women who have been subjected to virginity testing by being out in the public space. I quite like that one as a superhero, although it's a bit kind of girly. In conclusion, you're happy to find out now. The oppression of women is global, and I haven't even started on trans women. The resistance, whether women think of themselves as feminists or not, is also global. And it is here too, in this country. Think of Sarah Everard, killed and raped by a policeman, and then the vigil called to protest is attacked by the police. So we might be vigilant not just in Afghanistan, but wherever our rights are constrained or eroded. Here we face challenges too, the right to peaceful protest. Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, has blamed The Guardian reading tofu-eating wokarati for disruptive protests. The right to strike and introducing anti-strike legislation, which will curtail labour rights and allow employers to dismiss people. Now, I am proud to have been on strike with my colleagues over a number of work-related concerns. The solidarity is the key. Human rights and illegal migration, the so-called illegal migration bill, the Prime Minister said, "We believe the bill is compliant with the ECHR at the House of Commons Liaison Committee in March." The Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, shockingly said that there is a more than a 50% chance that the provision in the bill may not be compatible with international law. More than 50%, so it probably isn't. And state success in any of these areas will embolden them to row back on women's rights issues. Now, I have hopefully taken you on a journey, and as an academic, I have had the autonomy to research, write, and teach about gender, sexuality, and race. I've seen a generation of students, as Deborah pointed out, from undergraduate to doctoral students who have gone on to do great things. Today, I received a signed copy of a published book from Mickey Mayhew. Look him up. So I've seen a generation of students go through. And if there's one thing I would impress, is that I hope that they engage with the world in a critical manner where politics governs our lives and change things through collective action. And our claim to fame regarding women in politics is Marcia de Cordova. She studied here. I'm pretty sure she studied politics and European studies, correct? Okay, law and European. I stand corrected. And she was an MP for Battersea. She actually, I did speak to her, went to her celebratory party when she got elected in Battersea, and she said, I really didn't expect to be elected. It was just amazing. She said, I'm just amazed that they all came out. So she's one of our ex-students. She was Shadow Secretary for Women and Equalities from 6th of April 2020 until 14th of September 2021. And she's been to give a couple of talks at the university as well. On a final point, it is important, final point, it's important to remember, in the words of Arundhati Roy, Indian activist and author of The God of Small Things, we know, of course, there's really no such thing as the voiceless. There are only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard, and we don't want to be unheard. And the last word, I think, will go to the iconic Angela Davis, who I admire so much as a hero. I don't think we have any alternative other than remaining optimistic. Optimism is an absolute necessity, even if it's only optimism of the will. Thank you.